Hello again, and thanks for checking out another one of my instructional videos in Spanish. This one, we will be taking a look at stem-changing verbs in the preterite. If you remember, in the present tense, we have what we called stem-changing verbs or boot verbs. In the preterite, we have some stem-changing verbs, but these ones, instead of boot verbs, we'll call them sandal verbs. You'll see why in a second. What you're going to want to do is you're just going to have to sit down and memorize these, use them over and over again, and then eventually it'll become stuck in your head. But in the meantime, I'm going to show you the conjugation of them, and I'll ask you some questions with different ones so that you can have some practice and hopefully get them stuck in your head. So what we're going to do first is look at the verb pedír. Now remember, this is the preterite, el pretérito. So if you've forgotten the preterite, go back and review the conjugations of verbs in the preterite because you'll need to know that in order to do this correctly. So for the verb pedír, you'll notice on the board over here that I wrote down E-I and then comma I. What you're going to start noticing, if you haven't already done so, is that when you look up a verb, probably in the back of your textbook, it'll say E-I, comma I next to it. What that means is that in the present tense, pedír is a boot verb where the E changes to an I in those four positions. In the preterite, it's what we're going to call a sandal verb or stem-changing verb, where the E is going to change to an I. But it's not in the same places. So what I'm going to do for you now is I'm going to write down the conjugations of the verb pedír in the preterite. So you'll notice right now that the bottom two down here, that E changed to an I. So this is what we call a sandal verb, because instead of circling these four like a boot verb, you'll just be circling these two, which is more like a sandal rather than being a boot. It's kind of cheesy, but it's an easy way to remember it, I guess. So for pedír in the preterite, your endings are going to be the same as any other IR verb in the preterite. But in these two instances right here, that E is going to change to an I. So the pronunciation, just so you know, would be like this. Pedí, pediste, pidió, pedimos, pedisteis, pidieron. There are some other verbs in the preterite where the E changes to I. Those verbs are competir, preferir, repetir, y servir. And those verbs, the E in that bottom part will also change to an I. The verb preferir and repetir both have two E's in them. Remember that it's always going to be the E closest to the end with these verbs. So on preferir, it'll be the second E, and on repetir, it'll be the second E as well. So what I'm going to do right now is I will ask you 4 questions with the other verbs that I gave you. And if you've forgotten, quién means who. I'll be asking you who did something, and I'll give you the answer, who it is that did it in parentheses, and then I want you to tell me who it is that did this thing with the person in parentheses as your answer. So for example, if I use this verb pedir, I could say, ¿Quién pidió el taco? Which would be who ordered the taco. And maybe in brackets it said mi amigo. So you would say, mi amigo pidió el taco. Pues el número 1 es, ¿quién compitió en el partido? ¿Quién compitió en el partido? Mi amigo compitió en el partido. Mi amigo compitió en el partido. El número 2. ¿Quién prefirió el jugo? ¿Quién prefirió el jugo? Ellos prefirieron el jugo. Ellos prefirieron el jugo. El número 3. ¿Quién repitió la pregunta? ¿Quién repitió la pregunta? Yo repetí la pregunta. Yo repetí la pregunta. Y el número 4. ¿Quién sirvió el pastel? ¿Quién sirvió el pastel? Ella sirvió el pastel. Ella sirvió el pastel. So, but these verbs in the present tense, when they're boot verbs and they're IR verbs, in the preterite, they're going to be sandal verbs where the E changes to an I. It's a lot to remember. It just takes time and practice. I'm going to give you now one more instance where we have sandal verbs in the preterite. They're just a little bit different from these E to I verbs. We're just going to look at 2. We have one over here, the verb dormir. Dormir means to sleep if you're unaware. And you'll notice over here on the board I wrote O to UE. That means in the present tense, dormir is a boot verb where the O changes to UE. And then in the preterite, it's a sandal verb where the bottom 2, the O changes to a U. So the conjugations of dormir would be, okay, so you'll notice that the bottom 2, they're durmió and durmieron. The O changed to a U just in the bottom 2, hence sandal verb. The rest of them just follow the regular IR verb pattern, so hopefully that's nothing new for you. So what I'll do right now is I'm just going to ask you one question with the verb dormir, and I'll tell you what the other verb is, and then we'll be probably about done. So the question is, ¿Quién durmió en la casa? ¿Quién durmió en la casa? Mis amigos durmieron en la casa. Mis amigos durmieron en la casa. So this just take some time to memorize or remember that these verbs are sandal verbs. Take some time practicing conjugating them, writing them down. What I want you to do right now for me really quick is conjugate the verb servir in the preterite, which is a sandal verb where the E changes to I. And I also want you to conjugate the verb morir in the preterite, which is also a sandal verb where the O changes to U. And I'll put those up here on the screen. Pause the video, write them down really quick, make sure you got it, and then check and see if your answers are correct. Okay, so you have your answers on either side of me for morir and servir. Basically, just do some practice with them. Make sure you remember that these are sandal verbs. It's just the bottom two, where the E changes to an I or the O changes to a U. If you have any questions about sandal verbs or stem changing verbs in the preterite, make sure you ask, and then I'll answer it for you. Have a good day.